At first, she was regarded in London as a whisper rather than a name. The court's expense accounts listed clothes for the lady of the Queen's bedchamber, horses for the court lady's escort, and jewelry commissioned by a certain Alice. In the markets, people spoke of her only in hints, that the aging king had a new, close assistant. But the weaker Edward III became, the louder the city streets grew. Anonymous leaflets appeared on the walls of taverns, accusing the adult woman from the royal bedroom of controlling the treasury from her bed. The pamphlets wrote about the corrupt court, about judges who could be bought with a single glance, about poor plaintiffs who could not break through the network of courtiers. On parchment, all this looked like moralistic hysteria. In the office books, where rents, estates, and court decisions were recorded, something else was already apparent. The name Alice Perrers appeared more and more often where land, income, and influence on the royal courts were concerned. Hello, viewers. I appreciate your attention. Please write in the comments where you are watching this story and which stories about court favorites seem to you to be the most cruel or the most revealing. I wish you a peaceful and attentive listening experience. Let's move on to the story. To understand why the story of Edward III and Alice Perrers reads so disturbingly in the sources, we need to rewind to a time when the English crown still seemed strong and confident. The first decades of Edward's reign were not a scene of debauchery, but a scene of mobilization. The mature king, campaign after campaign, led the country into war against France, won battles at Sluys, Crécy, Poitiers, builds an image of a warrior monarch, creates the Order of the Garter, and bestows titles on his adult sons. During these years, the treasury works like a siege engine. Taxes, military loans, confiscation of property from those suspected of treason, income from royal lands. Everything goes into the furnace of a long war. London is getting used to the fact that blood and silver flow in the same direction. But any war exhausts not only soldiers, but also the system of government. By the middle of the 14th century, a wave of plague swept through England. The demographic blow broke the usual connections. Not only peasants and craftsmen die, but also officials, judges, and minor administrators. The crown, which at the beginning of its reign relied on a broad layer of capable people, is now forced to rely on a narrow circle of courtiers who can read, count, and move paper. Edward is aging. Chronic illnesses, the effects of injuries, and fatigue from decades of struggle make him less and less able to personally control the flow of letters and petitions. In these conditions, anyone who is allowed access to the royal bed and the table with documents automatically becomes a potential filter for requests, complaints, and the distribution of favors. Alice Perrers first appears in sources as a minor figure. Most likely, she was an adult woman of not the highest origin, associated with the house of Queen Philippa, either as a courtier or as one of the ladies serving her chambers. The expense books, record fabrics for her dresses, jewelry, and payment for servants. This is not yet power. but it is already access to the circle, where destinies are decided. After Queen Philippa's death, it was precisely this proximity to the physical side of the court, the bedroom, the wardrobe, the private rooms, that opened the way for her to the king himself. Where popular legend sees fatal passion, the document shows a steady increase in privileges. First jewelry, then rents, then land rights, and intervention in the courts. The myth that the mistress corrupted the king is convenient because it removes responsibility from the system. London pamphlets portrayed her as mature, greedy, capable of making the old monarch forget his duty. But if you look at parliamentary records and court scrolls, it becomes clear that the problem was not a romantic story, but the fact that a group had formed around the elderly Edward that used his weakness to gain access to resources. Among these people was not only Alice, there were also courtmen, lawyers, and tax collectors. However, it was convenient to pour concentrated hatred on her. A woman in the king's bed became the perfect symbol of wrong influence. From the late 1370s, Alice's name appears more and more often in letters granting land and rents. She receives estates confiscated from convicts. She is given the right to collect income from certain manors. Her people appear on the lists of those who dispose of court fines. To the bureaucratic eye, this looks like an alarming concentration of power in the hands of a private individual with little connection to the traditional aristocracy. For the urban elites and part of the knighthood, it is also a personal insult. Instead of dividing the spoils of war among the natural owners, the king generously rewards his new favorite and her associates. What is particularly frightening is how her influence seeps into the courtroom. Sources hint that Alice was present at the royal bench, could be found next to the judges, sometimes literally sitting on the bench, when cases involving the property and inheritance of adult plaintiffs were being heard. Pamphlets turned this into a grotesque. The favorite allegedly dictates sentences. In more dry documents, investigation reports, and complaints, the motive is different. Plaintiffs complain that they cannot get their cases heard without appealing to people associated with her, and judges behave as if they are afraid to go against the interests of the court. Meanwhile, Edward himself was no longer the man who had personally led troops into battle in his youth. In his old age, he became increasingly withdrawn into his own world. Illness, limited mobility, dependence on doctors, and his immediate entourage made him vulnerable to the influence of those who could get into his bedroom and at his desk. For an adult monarch of the 14th century, this is almost a death sentence. The king must be visible, must be personally present at councils and courts, for his decisions to be considered legitimate and respected. When his advisers and favorite speak more and more often in his place, confidence in justice crumbles. Against this backdrop, London begins to speak more sarcastically. Townspeople see taxes rising, the discipline of officials weakening, and decisions on property disputes increasingly depending on who has access to the court. In a city that has survived the plague and is accustomed to harsh realities, it is convenient to direct accumulated irritation at a specific point. Pamphlets and satirical texts attack Alice because she is both a real participant in the distribution of wealth and a convenient target. A woman who is foreign to the old aristocracy by origin, without the traditional shield of family ties. But if we try to piece together a picture based solely on these moral attacks, we end up with a striking but superficial image. The real investigation begins where Parliament enters the picture. By the mid-1770s, discontent was growing not only among the townspeople, but also among some of the nobility and knights who were concerned about their own positions. They were not concerned with rumors about the king's knights in his chambers, but with who signed the letters, who received the rents, and who blocked access to royal justice. When the so-called Good Parliament convened, the key focus of its work was not the moral condemnation of the favorite, but the verification of the channels of income distribution. Deputies representing counties and cities begin to ask questions. How did specific estates pass to Alice? Why is she allowed to receive interest from court fines? What role do people associated with her play in the king's entourage? They raise scrolls with seals, check dates and signatures, find out which judges were appointed through patronage, and which decisions on lawsuits clearly contradict previous practice. Many of them are themselves embroiled in local conflicts and know how pressure is exerted on the courts. Therefore, for them, the image of the bed that controls the treasury is not a metaphor, but a way of indicating that the upper echelons of power have ceased to be neutral arbiters. At the same time, there is another cause for concern: the crown's expenses. Wars with France, defeats, the ransom of prisoners, the maintenance of the court, payments to mercenaries. All this turns the treasury into a chronically ill institution. Against this backdrop, any large grants to the favorite are perceived not as the king's usual generosity, but as waste. Parliamentary complaints mention the amounts of rent and the value of the lands that passed to Alice. The grown men sitting in the chamber understand perfectly well that behind each figure there are hundreds of peasants who are now obliged to pay rent not to the king, but to a private individual whose power rests solely on his proximity to the aging monarch. The truth is that such grants had been made before to other favorites, relatives, and military leaders. But it is the combination of an ailing king, a long war, and a prominent figure at his bedside that makes Alice's case so explosive. Her possessions and income became the focus of a struggle between different groups of the elite. The old families saw her as a threat to their claims. The new officials saw her as too independent a player, and the London merchants saw her as a sign that royal justice had been replaced by personal gain. The myth likes to say that one woman corrupted the king and destroyed the state. The document paints a different picture: a system that had long been cracking under the weight of war, taxes, and weak justice, and a group of people who took advantage of this crack. Alice Perez in this system is not a magical demon, but a symptom. She is a grown woman who has learned to use royal favor to accumulate real economic and judicial power. And when Parliament begins its investigation, it is not interested in her feelings or bedroom details, but in how exactly her name came to be inscribed in the structure of the kingdom's government. It is from this moment that the story begins to move toward its grim but important turning point. The expulsion of the favorite will become not only a gesture of purification of the court, but also a way to redistribute control over the treasury and the courts. London will continue to cry out about the immoral woman. But within the walls of Westminster, grown men will count rents rather than sins, letters rather than kisses. And in this cold calculation it becomes clear that the question of who lies in the king's bed is of less interest to the authorities than the question of who signs orders about money and justice, which is why, by the end of Edward III's reign, London began to buzz not so much with the names of tax collectors or royal advisers as with the name of one woman. Pamphlets flying around the benches picked up and distorted rumors. They spoke of a favorite who allegedly sits at the old king's bedside and pulls gold toward herself, that court decisions are sold through her entourage, and that lands that belonged to respected families yesterday suddenly find themselves in the hands of people associated with her. Rude graffiti appeared on the walls, and tavern conversations were peppered with hints about the bed that controls the treasury. However, the louder these voices became, the more noticeable something else was. Those who really had power over taxes and courts talked much less about morality, and much more about who signs the letters and whose seals are on the salaries. Greetings, viewers, and thank you for your attention. Please write in the comments where you are watching this story from and which stories about the king's favorites seem most disturbing or most blatantly unfair to you. I wish you a peaceful and attentive listening experience. Let's move on to the story. To understand why Alice Perez became such a convenient and frightening target, we need to go back to what England looked like under Edward III at the end of his life. This was no longer the kingdom of the beginning of the century, frightened by the memory of failures and internal strife. This was a country that had tasted major victories in the 100 Years' War, captured the French king, collected huge ransoms, and seen streams of silver and gold flow through the treasury, only to see those streams dry up just as quickly. Victorious campaigns required money, which was collected through taxes and forced loans, and then used not only to fund campaigns on the continent, but also to build the careers of individuals at court. By this time, the king had been weakened by illness and age. The adult ruler, who once personally led armies, now spent most of his time in his chambers, surrounded by a small circle of confidants. The real burden of governance increasingly fell on small groups of courtiers, the chancellor, the treasurer, and those who had access to seals and documents. Against this backdrop, the appearance at court of a woman who was rapidly rising from the Queen's little-known entourage to positions where her name began to appear in court cases and letters patent proved to be a convenient focus for discontent. The myth of Perers was born where fear, envy, and economic crisis intersected. London had experienced the plague, population decline, trade disruptions, and increased tax burdens. In such years, it was especially easy to believe that all disasters stemmed from one wrong figure near the throne. Rumors painted her as predatory, ruthless, almost witch-like. It was said that she literally sat at the bedside of the dying king in the courtroom, interfering in decisions and pushing judges toward verdicts that were favorable to her. But if we move away from the language of pamphlets to documents, a different picture emerges. An adult woman receiving rents, estates, and privileges through legally valid letters that had passed through the royal chancellery. In the lists of grants from that time, Alice's name appeared alongside a list of manors, income from city markets, and rights to collect certain payments. These rents did not come out of thin air. Each was the result of a political decision to reward a loyal servant, to bind a necessary family to the court, to counterbalance the influence of an old faction. A common myth claims that the favorite robbed the country for her own whims. The document shows that most of her wealth came through the same channels as many other grants, through the royal seal, under the control of the same administration that distributed land among lords and courtiers. The turning point came when those who considered these channels their domain felt they were losing control. Parliament, already accustomed to seeing itself not only as a body that approved taxes, but also as a forum for complaints, began to focus on issues that turned into moral accusations in pamphlets and name-checking in the chamber. Who exactly sits in the royal chancellery? Who signs judicial decrees when the king is ill or absent? Who receives rents that could be divided between the old nobility and the urban elites? In one of the key episodes, which would later be called Good Parliament, official complaints against Perers were mixed with a deeper agenda. The deputies were not interested in her jewelry or her bed, but in a list of specific grants. They looked at the records in the scrolls, what estates and incomes had ended up in her hands, and in the hands of people associated with her. What court decisions, according to the evidence, had been made in favor of her entourage. How the ransoms received from the war had been distributed. The questions were phrased as moral accusations, but behind each moral formulation, there was clearly a struggle between influential groups for money and access to the royal body as a source of legitimacy. The judicial system was one of the main arenas of this struggle. By that time, the royal courts in England had long been the place where not only private disputes were decided, but also the fate of vast tracts of land, long-term leases, and rights to forests and water. The decision of a single judge could enrich one family and ruin another. If rumors circulated at court that a certain plaintiff was winning cases because he was connected to a favorite and paying through her, it undermined confidence in the entire justice system. Parliament, representing the interests of the barons and cities, could not ignore such a topic, even if some of these rumors were exaggerated or deliberate propaganda. It is here, at the level of legal procedures, that myth and document begin to diverge particularly sharply. Literary and later chronicle descriptions like to highlight scenes of vivid humiliation, Pereira's alleged public antics, excessive luxury, and interference in matters that she should not have touched. Archival materials, on the contrary, record investigation reports, lists of grants, and lists of court cases where her people are mentioned. There are no cries, but there are numbers, dates, and names. And if you follow the lines on these lists, it becomes clear that moral offensive fervor often covers purely economic interests, the desire to redistribute what has passed into the hands of others through the favorite. An important part of this process was the use of the image of the bed that controls the treasury as a political tool. It was advantageous for members of Parliament who wanted to weaken the king's entourage and regain their influence to portray the entire system of Edward's late reign as corrupted by private passion. Then every response to complaints became not just a question of taxes, but a battle to save the common good from a narrow circle of favorites. The accusations against Pereira became a convenient screen for criticizing the chancellor, the treasurer, and even the heir, without formally crossing the line of directly challenging royal authority. Edward himself was already physically weak at this time, which made the situation even more alarming. The worse the aging king felt, the more weight the rumors gained that decisions were being made not by him, but by those who had access to his chambers. Any woman close to the ailing monarch became an ideal target for the discontented. She could be accused of passing on requests, petitions, and bribes. In Pereira's case, this accusation coincided with her actual role. She did receive gifts. She was indeed present in the king's entourage, and she was indeed associated with people who benefited from their proximity to the court. But the point is not that she was different from others, but that her position allowed all the anger to be focused on her. At that time, London was in a state of constant instability. The townspeople remembered the recent tax collections caused by the war, remembered the consequences of the plague epidemics, and saw how rich merchants and nobles gained and lost capital on the fluctuations of royal policy. Pamphlets, leaflets, and oral stories created an atmosphere in which faith in the justice of the centers of power was melting away. The figure of the favorite became a symbol that personal proximity to the king's body was more important than any law. For medieval people, accustomed to the idea that justice should come from the monarch as the anointed one, this was not only a moral but also a political shock. Parliament used this atmosphere of mistrust to advance its own agenda. In the chamber, this was expressed not in emotional outbursts, but in demands for reports, audits,
and lists. Who exactly received certain rents at the expense of the crown? On what grounds did a particular person receive the right to use lands that previously belonged to others? Were royal gifts paid for from the monarch's personal funds, or were they actually gifts at the expense of taxpayers? These questions could only be answered by opening the archives and carefully examining the letters signed in recent years. The deeper the deputies dug, the clearer it became that the problem was not only and not so much in Perez. He was the tip of the iceberg, the face of a system in which a narrow circle of people around the aging king distributed benefits, taking advantage of his weakness and the complexity of the situation inside and outside the English kingdom. Tax money, compensation, land grants, all of this flowed through channels where personal patronage inevitably mixed with official function.
In such an environment, the appearance of a woman who quickly gained wealth and influence was perceived as a threat, first and foremost to those who were accustomed to considering these channels their own. What is most disturbing in the documents of that time is how easily moral arguments were turned into a tool of redistribution. The accusation of corrupting the king made it possible to cut off the flow of money without openly admitting it. No one said they wanted to take someone else's rent. Everyone claimed to be fighting vice at court. Accusations of corrupting the courts provided a reason to review the composition of judges and officials. Accusations of having an immoral mistress provided a mechanism for expelling a specific person without directly affecting the men who sat in the chancellery and oversaw financial flows. The myth that the bed ruled the treasury thus became a convenient mask. Behind it lay the real but far less cinematic struggle of adults for control over the treasury, the courts, and the apparatus of royal power. In this scheme, Perez was both a lucrative target and a living reminder that personal intimacy with the king could be turned into political capital. Removing her from the palace meant not so much restoring morality as seizing this capital and redistributing it among more acceptable groups. As pressure from Parliament intensified, the tone of the chronicles became increasingly alarming. Some authors took pleasure in recounting rumors, portraying Perez as an almost demonic figure. Others, closer to administrative work, dryly recorded the facts. Her presence at court hearings, her participation in the distribution of confiscated property, her appearance among the creditors and tenants of the crown. This dual perspective shows how a living human being is transformed into a symbol, and the image of a symbol into an instrument of administrative reform. When Parliament finally succeeded in expelling Perez from the court, the wording of the charges sounded like an attempt to rid the throne of influence incompatible with the good of the kingdom. Official rhetoric emphasized that her removal was an act of justice, a restoration of moral order, and a protection of the king from bad company. But if we look at what followed this step, it becomes clear that she herself was not the main target. Almost immediately after her expulsion, Parliament embarked on reforms of the chancellery, financial bodies, and judicial procedures, which were the real subject of the struggle. It is here, at the intersection of personal fate and institutional change, that the story of Edward and Alice becomes particularly grim. An adult woman who had become a symbol of corruption was in fact used as a lever to launch reforms that were long overdue. She was expelled. Her property was partially confiscated. Her name was blackened. But, after a while, many of the schemes that had worked through her were simply reassigned to other people. The treasury continued to need taxes. The courts continued to depend on the royal will, and the chancellery continued to be a place where proximity to the center of power gave advantages. The moral purification turned out to be more of a spectacle for the cities and barons, while the real outcome of the conflict was a redistribution of access to documents and seals. And in this dry, almost bureaucratic denouement, the gap between myth and archive is particularly clear. The myth tells of a woman who led the old king astray and impoverished the country. The archive shows a protracted conflict among the elites over who has the right to make notes in the margins of letters, whose names will be recorded in the list of rent recipients, and who will stand next to the throne in the last years of the reign. The bed is only a convenient metaphor here, and the treasury is not actually managed by emotions, but by skills in working with paper, seals, and the fears of the people to whom these papers are shown. The story continues after Parer's expulsion, when Parliament, having achieved a symbolic victory over vice, takes on a much quieter but important task: dismantling and reworking the mechanisms through which the elites ruled the state, hiding their interests behind the backs of kings and the shadows of their favorites. And it is at this moment that it becomes clear that the expulsion of the Perriers was not the end, but the beginning of a phase where the most vocal accusations dissolve, leaving only the bare mechanics of power. The pamphlets fall silent as quickly as they appeared. The city vented its anger. Parliament got a convenient excuse to act, but the real consequences manifested themselves quietly at the level of documents. New names appeared in the treasury records, the same families, the same groups that had been waiting for years for the moment to regain control of the royal finances. And they were the first to begin redistributing the rents that had previously gone through Parers. No document mentions this directly, but the figures themselves suggest that no place remains empty, and everything that leaves one favorite immediately ends up in the hands of another. The court now acted more cautiously. People who had recently promoted their affairs through Parers' associates hastened to change their patrons, emphasizing their loyalty to Parliament or to the heir, who was visibly becoming the main link in the chain of power. The judges worked under pressure. Every verdict in favor of a person associated with the king's former entourage became a cause for suspicion. In the corridors of Westminster, dry explanations were given. Royal justice needed to be restored to health. The courts had to restore trust, and the chancellery had to work transparently. But behind these formulas lay a struggle between influential groups over who would determine the value of court decisions and who would put their seal on new land grants. The most dismal fact was that the reforms, launched under the slogan of "fighting the favorite," actually concerned a structure built by grown men long before her appearance. The minutes of the meetings show that the deputies demanded a redistribution of functions, a limitation of the influence of individual chancellors and treasurers, and a review of the practice of appointing judges. But no one proposed changing the very principle that access to the royal body, whether it was the sick monarch's private chamber or a council meeting, gave the key to the treasury. Pereiras disappeared, but the system that created her influence remained intact. Her own fate after her expulsion is unclear in the sources. She tried to recover some of her property, appealing to those who still enjoyed the king's favor, but her name appeared less and less frequently in documents. It seemed that the very structure of the record was pushing her out of the political arena, replacing a living person with a set of numbers and dates. What was presented in pamphlets as the fall of an evil favorite was in fact the squeezing out of a figure who was no longer useful to the system. She was removed in the same way that an unnecessary expense item is removed from an account book. When the king died, the story came to an end without a dramatic explosion. There were no public apologies, no solemn admission of guilt or rehabilitation. London was preoccupied with new disputes about succession, taxes, wars. The name Pereiras became a whisper used to explain why it is dangerous to trust the authorities. But the documents preserved a much more prosaic truth. Her expulsion was just a minor episode in the great struggle between Parliament, the courtiers, and the departments, which for decades had been blurring the boundaries between law and influence. And it is in this silence that followed her disappearance that the main point can be heard most clearly. The myth spoke of a woman who corrupted the king. The document shows dozens of adult men who, for years, hid behind this image in order to reshape access to the treasury and the courts to suit themselves. And yet the storm did not disappear completely. It simply changed its target. When the passions surrounding Pereiras subsided, Parliament, for the first time in a long time, got a taste for executive power. A new, almost imperceptible word appears in the documents: supervision. It was used to explain everything: financial audits, payment reviews, restrictions on the powers of royal clerks. But there was something else behind it. Parliament wanted any decision to be tracked, not through the king's whims, but through its own commissions. And it was this hidden shift that was most painful for the court. The royal chancellery, which until recently had been confident in its influence, suddenly found itself in the position of people being called in for questioning. Some clerks admitted that they had signed letters without checking their content. Some tried to justify strange payments by referring to the will of the monarch. Others remained silent, hoping that Parliament would tire of digging up old cases. But Parliament did not tire. It saw in the chaos of Edward's late reign a chance, the only one in decades, to gain control over the mechanisms of royal power that had previously been inaccessible. English society was also changing. Pamphlets that had once been used against the Perriers were now being turned against judges, treasurers, and sheriffs. They were accused of taking bribes, delaying cases, selling decisions, and manipulating taxes. There were more and more names, and fewer people believed that one woman could be the cause of the discord. The country was getting used to the idea that the problem lay in the system itself, not in those who briefly found themselves in the spotlight. Meanwhile, the heir was consolidating his position, and this affected everyone. The young future king wanted to ensure that his reign would not resemble his father's final years. He sought allies among those who supported reform and cautiously removed figures too closely associated with past scandals. The council minutes show that new faces appeared faster than the old ones could realize they were losing influence. And although no one spoke about it openly, Pereiras' disappearance became a watershed moment. After her, the court began to view any attempts to get close to the monarch through personal relationships differently. This was compounded by the medical side of Edward's fate. The aging king was increasingly absent from political life. His weakness made the structure of power fragile. Each faction tried to pull the channels of influence to itself. Clerks wrote letters on behalf of the king, even though he hardly made any decisions anymore. Advisors acted as if the monarchy could be run without the monarch's involvement. It was in this crack that the opportunity for parliamentary reforms arose, quiet but long-term ones. The whole story looks even harsher when viewed through the lens of accounting. There are no complaints, no emotions, no posters against the king's favorites, only numbers. These numbers clearly show that the largest rents, which were the subject of pamphlets, quickly found new recipients with prominent London surnames. The courts, which, according to the accusers, were sold to Pereiras immediately after her expulsion, handed down decisions to the same influential groups. No purification took place. One intermediary was simply replaced by others, and the fate of Pereiras herself disappears into obscurity. Her later years were a combination of attempts to protect her property, rare appearances in court, and steps toward a private life, about which the chronicles speak reluctantly. She is a grown woman who lived in the shadow of the monarch and was then thrown out of the center of events as soon as she was no longer needed. And it is precisely this silence, this lack of a tragic climax, that makes her story so grim. She became a convenient figure onto whom the responsibility for the failures of an entire regime could be shifted. When Parliament completed its investigation and began to impose the first restrictions on the royal chancelleries, no one spoke of her influence anymore. Her role in politics ceased to exist, as if she had never advised the king, never signed documents, never served as a convenient mythological cloak for the mistakes of others. History simply turned the page, and the same hands that had previously controlled rents, courts, and offices continued to operate. And this is where the main point becomes clear. The myth screamed that the bed rules the treasury. The document shows a chain of adults who ruled the treasury long before her and continued to do so after her. Her expulsion became a symbol, but not a solution. The system remained the same, harsh, closed, deaf to the pain of individuals. And when the political dust settled, it became clear that the Pereira's case was not the end of an era, but a mirror in which England saw its own distortions for the first time. The grandchildren of merchants, the children of sheriffs, the heirs of knights began to understand. If a favorite could be blamed for all the troubles of the state, then any other convenient object could be used in the same way. This knowledge did not disappear. It sprouted in city schools, in legal circles, in the Latin notes of young clerks who already read parliamentary records as a guide to how power works, rather than as a moral story about the decline of morals. Meanwhile, reforms of the Chancellery continued apace. The changes were not dramatic, but rather quiet. New rules for storing seals, a new structure for appointments, a review of the powers of those who had access to the royal signature, restrictions on the influence of the monarch's domestic circles. All this looked like dry, almost technical corrections, but they were a direct response to the years when personal proximity could open access to rents and royal justice. Court records, compiled a decade after Pereira's expulsion, reveal this transformation. Decisions began to be better documented. Reasons were more often recorded in written formulas, and complaints about the corruption of judges began to be considered more quickly. Not because the country suddenly became more honest, but because Parliament learned to observe. Against this backdrop, Pereira's herself seems to dissolve into the depths of the century. Her name disappears from large collections of documents, remaining only in documents on land disputes and several attempts to defend the right to a widow's share. She will live out her life not as a debauched woman, as she was portrayed in pamphlets, but as an adult who has lost access to power and is trying to preserve what remains. There is no dramatic finale here, and it is precisely the absence of a dramatic denouement that makes her story so cruel. No one was going to truly punish her or save her. She was a tool, and when the tool was no longer needed, it simply disappeared from view. Meanwhile, England was entering a new cycle. The king's illnesses, the struggle for influence around the heir, the protracted disputes over the financing of the war, all this created an atmosphere of slow decay. But now Parliament and the urban elite saw that they could put pressure on the crown, not through conspiracies, but through procedures. Pereira's became the first major figure through whom the mechanism of control over those who had access to the seal and the treasury was worked out. Her fall was a sign that even proximity to the monarch did not guarantee immunity. Pamphlets against her, which previously seemed to be a detailed description of her power, now look different. They reveal the elite's desire to hide their own mistakes and shift the city's anger onto a convenient culprit. But the documents show that they were not interested in her immorality, but in her access to the mechanisms that they themselves wanted to regain control of. And this becomes the last mask that history removes. She did not destroy the courts and finances. She simply stood in the way of those who wanted to take her place. When historians later try to determine what exactly changed her rise and fall, the answer sounds unexpected. Not morality, but the technology of power. The struggle was not for the king's feelings, not for morals, not for the purification of the court, but for the channels of decision-making, for signatures, for spheres of influence. The reforms of the chancellery will outlive all the participants in this story. They will survive dynasties, wars, and new storms. And in these dry lines, we can see the final proof. The fate of Pereira was only a shell through which the state rebuilt its own mechanism. The myth will say that the favorite corrupted the king. The document answers differently. The struggle was for access to resources, to judicial procedures, to channels of power. Her fall became a convenient spectacle behind which much deeper structural changes were hidden. And she herself, a grown woman who found herself at the center of the whirlwind, disappeared from the chronicles, as dozens of figures turned into symbols disappear. And this silence, cold and even, remains the most honest outcome of the whole story.